Hi, I'm Donna Kelce, Taylor Swift's mother-in-law. 2 days ago, my daughter-in-law sat on a stage at the Grammy Museum and recited a verse from memory that she wrote when she was 18 years old. It is about a child running through a pumpkin patch and hugging somebody's legs and falling asleep on the way home. There is no word for the woman in it, not mother, not mom, not once in the whole thing. And she said it out loud 18 years later without looking at anything. I sat down. I want to be specific about that, because I am 73 years old, and I do not sit down dramatically. I have watched that woman do a great many things over 3 years, and I have kept my feet. I sat down twice in that hour. The first time was a verse about a pumpkin patch. The second time was a sentence in the first 10 minutes that I did not react to at all, and that has taken me 2 days and 4 viewings to understand, and it is not about her. It is about my son. And then something happened afterward that I have not been able to shake for 2 days, and it is not about either of them. She said one thing on that stage, offhand, about her own work, 3 words, and I put the telephone down and stood in my own kitchen and understood that I cannot hear my mother. Not remember her, hear her. 45 years of a woman I spoke to nearly every day, and I have got the words, and I have not got the voice, and I could not tell you what year it went. There is a thing at the end of this that I did about it on Friday afternoon with a telephone propped against a jar, and I felt like an absolute fool doing it, and I would like every woman my age to do it too. So, this is a video about a video, which I am aware is a strange thing to make. Because everybody covered the one line. You have seen it, the washed up at 22 thing. It went everywhere in 4 hours. And there is an hour of that recording that nobody has been through properly. I have been through it 4 times, and I have got 9 things. Let me give you the 9 things. Part 1. She was 10. The first thing she says, almost, is that she was 10. She said she was about 10 when she started obsessively thinking about and planning how it would be possible for her to make music for the rest of her life. Obsessively. Her word. And then she said what she did about it, which is the part that got me. She said she did research. A 10-year-old did research. She had heard that Faith Hill was discovered at the Bluebird Cafe, so she started learning about the Bluebird Cafe, and she made it a personal life goal to get to perform there. At 10. I want to put that next to something because I could not help it. My son was 10 in 1999. I know exactly what he was doing at 10 because I was there, and what he was doing was being enormous and loud in a driveway in Euclid, Ohio, and eating everything in my kitchen. He was not doing research. I said that to Ed on Wednesday night. I said, she was doing research at 10. And my husband said, about what? And I said, about how to become what she became. And Ed Kelce said, at 10? And I said, at 10? And he was quiet for a second, and then he said, our 2 were putting a lawnmower engine in something at 10. And I said, I remember. And he said, that also worked out. In fairness. Part 2. The thing about remembering. Here is the sentence I sat down for the second time. It is at about 8 minutes in. Somebody asked her where the storytelling came from, and she said, I never turned to music to forget my human experience. I turned to music to remember it. I did not react the first time. It is a good sentence, and she says a great many good sentences, and I moved on. I came back to it on the third watch, and I stopped the video. Because I have spent 3 years watching 2 people who do the same thing and I could never work out the difference, and it is that. She uses her work to remember. My son uses his to forget. I want to be careful because I am about to say something about somebody I love that he has never said and might not agree with. But I have watched Travis Kelce play football since he was 7 years old, and I know what it does for him. It empties him out. That is what he has always said about it, in about 9 different ways, since he was a teenager, He says things like, "It's the only 2 hours where there's nothing else." He said to me once, after a very bad week in about 2019, that the field is the only place where his head is quiet. That is not remembering. That is the opposite. She writes things down so she does not lose them. He goes out onto a field so he can stop carrying them for 2 hours. And I sat down in my kitchen on the third watch of an hour-long video about songwriting and thought, they are opposite instruments. And then I thought, and in about 4 months he might not have his anymore. I have not said that to anybody, and I am saying it here. That man has one place where his head is quiet, and it is a grass field, and he is 36 years old. And she has a thing she can do until she is 90. I called him yesterday. I did not tell him why I was calling. I said, "Have you watched Taylor's Grammy Museum thing?" And Travis said, "Bits." And I said, "Watch the first 10 minutes." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Just watch it." He called me back 4 hours later and said, "Which bit?" And I said, "The remembering one." And there was a pause. And my son said, "Yeah, I clocked that." I said, "What did you think?" And he said, "I thought, that's not me." I said, "No." And he said, "I've never once done anything to remember something, Mom. Everything I do is to get through the day and then I do the next day." He said, "That's not a complaint. It's worked great. I've had an unbelievable life." Then he said, "But she's got a filing cabinet, and I've got a bin." Part 3. The 35-year-old woman. Now here is one for the people listening to this, and it is my favorite thing in the whole hour. She was 16 and putting out a country album about being in 10th grade. And she said that people on the label side said to her, and this is her account, on a stage, 20 years later, they said, "The country music demographic is a 35-year-old female. How are they going to relate to you writing songs about your life in 10th grade?" And she said, on that stage, "It is a fair question," which I think is extremely generous of her, 20 years later, about a room of men who were wrong. And then she said the reason it worked. She said it was because she did not listen to the people who said she did not have a valid perspective on life because she did not fit into a demographic that they had studied. I want to sit with that for a second, because I am talking to a great many women who are considerably older than 35. There were men in a room in Nashville in about 2005 with a piece of paper that said, "The customer is a 35-year-old woman." And they were correct about that. They had studied it. And they used it to tell a 16-year-old that her life was not relevant. I have been on the other end of that piece of paper my entire adult life. Everybody my age has. You are a demographic. You have been a demographic since about 1985. There are men in rooms who have studied you, and who know what you buy, and who make decisions about what you are offered. And almost none of them have ever asked you anything. She was 16, and she said no. And the album about 10th grade was bought by an enormous number of 35-year-old women, which is the funniest possible outcome, and which nobody at that table saw coming. Part 4. The truck. This one is small, and it made me laugh out loud in an empty kitchen. In the Tim McGraw song, the first one, the one she wrote at 15, there is a line about a boy in a Chevy truck that has a tendency of getting stuck on back roads at night. And she explained it on that stage. She said if you look at it at face value, you think, oh, that truck broke down a lot. And then she said what it actually is. It is two teenagers who used to park and kiss and tell their parents the truck broke down. She wrote that at 15. She put a lie that teenagers tell their parents into a country song at 15 years old, and it sat in plain sight for 20 years, and she explained it on Monday. I want to tell you what I did about 4 seconds after I heard it. I went and found Ed. I said, "Did you ever tell your mother a truck broke down?" And my husband said, "What?" And I said, "Answer the question." And Ed Kelce looked at me for about 2 seconds and said, 1969. I said, Ed. And he said, it did not break down. And I said, I know it didn't break down. And he said, it was a very reliable truck. I have been married to that man since 1980, and I found that out on Wednesday because of a country song from 2006. Part 4.5. Matching the sound to the feeling. There is a section about 10 minutes long where she explains something about how she works that I have not been able to stop thinking about, and it is the most practical thing in the hour. She said that on the album Speak Now, which she wrote entirely on her own, she learned how to take a feeling and build the sound around it, so that the song sounds exactly like the thing it is about. And then she gave 3 examples, and I want to give you all 3 because they are perfect. She said there is a song called Enchanted, which is about falling in love, about that glittery, twinkly fairy lights feeling, and she said that is exactly how the song sounds. She said there is a song called Never Grow Up, which is sung to a small child asleep in a crib, and it sounds exactly like a lullaby. And then she said there is a song called Mean, which was about criticism, and at the time, one of the criticisms she was getting was that she was not country enough. And she said, so I put just as much banjo on it as we could possibly put on. I laughed out loud in an empty kitchen for the second time in 1 hour. A 20-year-old was being told she was not country enough, and she made a song about being criticized and buried it in banjo. That is not a defense. That is not even a response. That is a young woman making a joke that will still be funny in 100 years. And then she said the thing that is actually the technique. She said that learning to do that forward, feeling first, then sound, meant that later she could do it backwards. She said that if somebody sends her a track, she can listen to the first 5 seconds and know what the song is. And then she demonstrated it, live, on a stage, off the top of her head. She said, I'd listen to 5 seconds and be like, oh my God, this is about a girl who goes home to her hometown on holiday break, and it's cold, and she falls in love with her old high school flame again, but she has to go back to the big city, but she's fallen in love with him over the course of 2 days. What's she going to do? She invented an entire song in about 11 seconds because somebody asked her a question. The man interviewing her said, that is awesome right there. And he was correct, and I have watched that particular 90 seconds 5 times. I want to say something about it. I have watched my daughter-in-law be extraordinary at a great many things in 3 years, and almost all of them are things I cannot assess, because I do not know anything about music. That is the first time I have watched her do the actual work in front of me. For 11 seconds, on a stage, she stopped being famous and was just extremely good at her job, and it was the most impressive thing in the entire hour. Part 4.75. Never a lateral move. There is a phrase she used twice that I have written on the back of an envelope. She said she has always been fascinated and challenged by the idea of never making a lateral move creatively. Never a lateral move. I have thought about that for 2 days in relation to a great many things, and I want to say one of them. I have made a lateral move approximately every year since about 1991. I do not mean that as self-pity. I have had an extremely good life, and I would not trade any of it. But if I am honest about the last 35 years, a great deal of it was doing roughly what I had done the year before, in a slightly different arrangement, and calling it stability, which it was. I said the phrase to Ed on Wednesday night. I said, never make a lateral move. And my husband said, who said that? And I said, Taylor. And Ed Kelce thought about it for a moment and said, 1989 was not lateral. I said, no, it was not. And he said, it was straight down. And then he said, and then it was fine. Part 5. The dubstep. I love this one, and I did not understand it at first. She wrote a song called I Knew You Were Trouble, and she wrote it as a sad piano ballad. And she brought it into a room with 2 producers she had gone to specifically, and she played them this sad ballad, and she said she thought it should be just piano, no drums. And they said, "What if it's dubstep?" She had to say the word dubstep on a stage at the Grammy Museum, and I want everybody to know that she said it with a completely straight face. And she said her reaction was, and this is a paraphrase, but it is close. She said something like, "Oh no, I don't know, guys. Let's give it a run." And then she said, "It ended up being the best thing for it." And then she said the thing that is actually the lesson. She said her favorite people to be in a room with are yes and people. She said, "I came to them specifically because I did not want to be making lateral moves creatively." Why wouldn't we go down that path? I have thought about this for 2 days in relation to my own family, and I want to say something about it. Kelce men are not yes and people. I want to be honest about that because I have made 10 of these videos this summer, and I have been extremely warm about all of them, and this is a true thing that is not warm. Ed is a no and here is why man. Jason is a let me think about it man. Travis is. Travis is enthusiastic about everything, which sounds like yes and but is not the same thing because he is enthusiastic about the thing he already wanted to do. I said this to Kylie on Thursday. I said, "Are the Kelce men yes and people?" And Kylie Kelce said, "Absolutely not." She did not pause. She said it in about a quarter of a second. She said, "Donna, that family has one setting for an idea, which is to go quiet and then say something practical about it." She said, "I have brought Jason maybe 200 ideas in 11 years, and I have received about 4 unqualified yeses." Then she said, "To be fair, he was right about most of them." I said, "Does Taylor do it to Travis?" And Kylie said, "Constantly." She said, "I've watched it about 9 times. He says something stupid, and she says, 'Okay, and he gets to finish it.'" She said, "Nobody in that family has ever let him finish an idea in his life. We all take it apart while it's still coming out." Part 6. The Cave. Now the hard one. She talked about the Reputation period, which was 2017, and she described what it was. She said it was a time when for the first time, and she said, not the last, which I noticed, people had actively tried to misunderstand her, to misunderstand what she was trying to say, and to purposely misinterpret it. And then she said the sentence that I want every woman listening to this to hear. She said, "When people are in a hate frenzy about a public figure, or really anyone, it could be your daughter in her middle school class. When people decide we're all going to stand around someone and point and mock them, you can't respond with outward sincerity." She said, "Any attempts you make to explain yourself earnestly or sincerely will just be mocked even worse. Or really anyone. It could be your daughter in her middle school class." She put that in. She was on a stage at the Grammy Museum, talking about one of the largest public shamings in modern celebrity history, and she stopped and put a middle school classroom in it. Nobody made her do that. Nobody asked about children. She did it because she knows exactly what she is describing, and she knows it is the same thing at every scale. And then she described what she did. She said the album is about feeling so upset about a mass shaming that you find a little cave and you crawl in there and you try to find a tiny bit of warmth, and that warmth sustains you for the entire time that you feel massively misunderstood by people who do not know you. I want to say something to the grandmothers. If you have got a girl in your life between about 11 and 15, that is the description. That is the whole thing, from somebody who survived it at the largest possible scale. You cannot explain yourself out of it. You find a cave, and you find one warm thing in it, and you wait. I called Kylie about this one too. She has 4 girls. Wyatt is 6. Elliot is 5. And I said, "Wyatt's got about 5 years." And Kylie Kelce was quiet for a second. And then she said, "I've thought about that every day since she was born." She said, "And I'll tell you the thing I've decided, which is that I cannot stop it." She said, I've got 4 daughters, and at least one of them is going to have a year. Probably more than one. She said, so I'm not building a wall. There is no wall. Then she said, I'm trying to be the cave. Part 6.5. The album about being alone. There is a bit about the album Folklore that I want to put in because of who is listening to this. She said it is an album that is really, really all about loneliness. And then she said, which weirdly everyone on the globe was feeling to some extent. She was talking about 2020, and she is right, and everybody remembers it. And then she said the thing. She said that putting out that album and having everybody be able to say, oh yeah, I felt that way too, was the most intense feeling of unification she has ever felt. I want to say something about that to the women my age, and I am going to be direct. You were the loneliest people in that year, and almost nobody wrote about it.
Shalin 2 and 2Y.
Everybody wrote about young people not being able to go out. Everybody wrote about parents at home with children. Everybody wrote about the workers. Nobody wrote a great deal about a 70-year-old woman on her own in a house for 14 months. I know 3 of them. One of them did not have a conversation with another human being in the same room for something like 9 weeks. And a 30-year-old woman in a house somewhere made an album about being completely alone, and it turned out to be the thing. I did not listen to it at the time. I want to be honest about that. It came out in 2020, and I had no idea who she was, and I was doing something else. I have listened to it this week, for the first time, at 73 years old, because of an hour-long video about songwriting. I have got opinions, and I am not going to give them, because nobody wants a 73-year-old woman's opinion about that record. But there is a song on it about somebody being at peace, and I had to stop the car. Part 6.75. Writing as somebody else. And then she said something about that album that connects to something else, and I do not think anybody has put them together. She said that on Folklore she was often creating characters and writing as them and having them interact with each other, and that it was a pressure release valve. She used that phrase, pressure release valve. She said it was an escape into her imagination. She said all of a sudden she was walking on a cliffside looking at the ocean instead of just being at home. And then, later in the same conversation, she mentioned that she has just written in character for Toy Story 5, for Jessie. And she said why, and it is the reason I am including any of this. She said she has always watched those films specifically to see that character. She said she relates to how she reacts to certain situations. She said she relates to how deeply her heart was broken, and how deeply she feels, and how she protects the people she loves. And then she said, it's a lot more fun to write from a character when you really understand their motivations, because you relate to them. I want to tell you what I did with that. I went and watched a bit of Toy Story 2. I am 73 years old, and I sat in my kitchen on Wednesday afternoon and watched about 11 minutes of an animated film from 1999 because my daughter-in-law mentioned a character in an interview, and there is a part in it where that character is left. I am not going to describe it because everybody with children born after about 1990 knows exactly the part I mean and has been ambushed by it before. But I watched it, and I understood something about the woman my son married that I did not understand on Tuesday. She has spent 20 years being the most looked-at person on earth, and the character she picked, the one she said she has always watched those films to see, is a toy who was put in a box. I did not say anything to her about it. I want to be clear that I have not raised it, and I am not going to. She said a thing about a cartoon in an interview, and I do not need to make it a whole matter. But I sat in my kitchen and watched 11 minutes of a children's film on a Wednesday afternoon, and I did not entirely recover from it. Part 7. The Mocking. This is the one nobody has quoted, and it is the funniest thing in the hour. Somebody asked her how she keeps public perception from blocking her creativity, and she said, sometimes it fuels it. And then she said, Sometimes when people are mocking me, it's really fun to mock them back. And then she said, and I had to rewind this. She said, sometimes I like to just use words that they have to look up in order to talk about. I want you to understand what that is. That is a woman saying, on the record, at the Grammy Museum, that when people are unpleasant about her, she deliberately writes vocabulary they will have to go and look up before they can be unpleasant about it. I told Ed. He laughed for about 11 seconds. I told Jason. Jason said, that is the most terrifying thing I have ever heard about that woman. I told Travis. And my son said, oh, she does that. And I said, you knew? And he said, Mom, I've had to look up about 4 words this year. I said, from her songs? And Travis Kelce said, from arguments. Part 8. The Coping Mechanism. There is a part where she is asked how she manages all of it, and she describes what she calls one of her processes. And she said it very plainly. She said she tells herself, you chose this. You chose this every day. You could have opted out of this any day before it got unmanageably big. And I decided not to because I love it that much. And she said, everything that comes with this ultimately is worth it as long as I get to still make music. I have thought about this one for 2 days, and I want to say why it bothers me slightly. Not because it is wrong, it is obviously correct, and it is obviously working, because it has a condition in it. As long as I get to still make music. That is a load-bearing sentence, and there is a hinge in the middle of it. And I do not know what happens to that particular coping mechanism on a day when the thing you love is not available to you, because everybody's eventually is not. I did not say that to her. I want to be clear about that. I have not said one word of this to my daughter-in-law, and I am not going to, because she is 36 years old, and it is working, and I am not going to walk into a functioning system with a screwdriver. But I have watched somebody run out of one. My husband's ended in 1989. Ed Kelsey's version of As Long as I Get to Still Do the Thing ran for about 20 years, and then the thing was not available anymore, and he was 36 years old. Which is, and I did not notice this until I was writing it down, exactly the age my son is now. Part 9. The Song About a Mother. Here is the one I sat down for. About 51 minutes in, she is explaining what she means by being a confessional songwriter, and she makes a point that details should not be decorative, that they have to count. And then she gives an example. She said there is a song on Fearless, her second album, written entirely from the perspective of a child singing about their mother. And she said, you never hear the word mom, or mother, or mommy, or anything like that. And then she recited it. From memory, on a stage, 18 years after she wrote it. She said, it's getting cold, I've got my big coat on. She said, I hear your laugh and look up, smiling at you. She said, I run and run past the pumpkin patch, through the tractor rides. She said, look now, the sky is gold. She said, I hug your legs and fall asleep on the way home. And then she said, and those details serve the purpose of telling us exactly who our narrator is. I sat down. I want to explain what happened, because I have thought about it for 2 days, and I have got it now. It is not the song. The song is lovely, and I had never heard it, and I have now heard it about 9 times. It is that there is no word for the woman in it. The whole thing is a child looking up at somebody, and there is not one noun anywhere. You know exactly who it is by the 4th line, and it is because a child ran through a pumpkin patch and came back and hugged a pair of legs and fell asleep in a car. That is the entire experience of being somebody's mother between about 1989 and 1997, and I have never seen it written down. I want to tell the women my age something, and then I am going to stop. That is what you get. You do not get the word. You almost never get the word in the sense that anybody means it. You get mom, shouted from another room approximately 9,000 times a year for 18 years, which is not the same thing. What you get is the legs. You get somebody who ran as far as they could and then came back and hugged your legs and fell asleep on the way home, and did not say anything about it and does not remember it. Both of mine did it. In Ohio, in about 1994 and 1996. I had entirely forgotten, and a 36-year-old woman recited a song on a stage in Los Angeles and put me in a car in 1996 with a 7-year-old asleep against my arm. Part 9.5. The dog ate my homework. I want to give you the re-recording bit because she was funny about it in a way she has not been before. She described going back and re-recording everything as, "It's like when the dog actually did eat your homework, and now I have to redo it all, and then I have to go in to the teacher and say the dog ate my homework." And she said that because it had not been done that way before, on that scale, the public sort of side-eyed her the way a teacher would. She said she had to start from a place of everybody saying it was not going to work, and nobody was going to want to hear her new take on the same work. And then she said the phrase. She said it got to a place where it felt like a defiant reclamation of what was always mine to begin with. I have been saying that phrase out loud for 2 days, and Ed has asked me to stop. Defiant reclamation of what was always mine to begin with. There is a woman I know in Ohio who is about my age, and who, in 2011, after her husband died, went and got something back from a member of his family that had been taken during the illness. It took her 4 months, and it was extremely unpleasant, and it was worth about $600. I have never had a word for what that was, and now I have. And then there is the bit about the fans, and I want to put it in because I think it is the single most misunderstood thing about my daughter-in-law. She told 2 stories. The first is about All Too Well, which was never a single. She said she was personally proud of it and hoped the fans would gravitate toward it, and they did. And then when the Grammys came around, the fans just started saying, "Please play All Too Well." So she played it, and she said the whole life of that song has been powered by fans caring about it. The second is Cruel Summer, which was on an album from 2019 and was never a single. And 3 years later, she was putting together the Eras tour, and the fans were saying, "All we want to hear is Cruel Summer." So she put it first in the set, and it went strange and viral. And then the label came to her and said, "Would you like to put out Cruel Summer as a single from a 3-year-old album?" And she said, "You can do that?" And it turns out you can. I want to point at something. Everybody talks about the relationship between that woman and the people who listen to her as though it is a devotion running one direction. Twice in that hour, she described them changing her professional decisions. Not influencing, changing. A song went to #1 4 years late because they would not stop asking. I said that to Travis on Thursday. I said, "They run the operation." And my son said, "Mom, I've been saying that for 2 years. He said, "People think she's got some machine, and she's the boss of it." He said, "She is not the boss of it. She's in a conversation with about 10 million people, and they get a vote, and they know they get a vote." Then he said, "It's the only thing about her job I actually understand." And I said, "Why?" And Travis Kelce said, "Because that's Arrowhead." He said, 76,000 people who think it's theirs and are correct. Part 10. What she said at the end. She was asked what she hoped the room would take away. And she said 3 things, and I want to give you all 3, because they are good, and because the third one is the one I have written down. She said, "I hope that you will show up to work even when the idea fairy doesn't." She said, "I hope that you will not be the person who shoots down everyone's ideas in the room, but has not brought any of your own." And then she said, "I hope you remember that in the music industry, as wild and ever-changing as it is, enthusiasm can protect you from anything." And then she said, "I would know." Two words at the end of a sentence. I would know. That is a woman who has been publicly humiliated at least twice, at a scale most people cannot imagine, saying on a stage that the thing that got her through it was enthusiasm. Not resilience. Not toughness. Not any of the words that get used about her. Enthusiasm. And I sat in my kitchen on the fourth watch and thought, she married the most enthusiastic man in the United States of America. Part 10 and a half. The Notes app. There is a practical bit near the end that I want to give the women listening, because it is the only genuinely usable instruction in the entire hour. She was asked how a song starts, and she said if you limit yourself to one way, you are cutting off a lot of opportunity. And then she described the Notes app. She said she does not write a song every day, but she will have a cool twist of a common phrase almost every day. And she said her Notes app is, her word, crazy. She said it is just scroll, 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 scroll. She said you could scroll forever. And then she said why it matters. She said that when she is in a session and locks into that state of writing, she can scroll through and immediately find something and go, this fits. This is what this is about. And then she said the thing about melodies, and I want everybody over 65 to hear it. She said, if I have a melody, I will grab my phone no matter what embarrassing social situation I am in. Because, and she said this twice, you think you will remember it, you will not. She described the specific moment. Drifting off to sleep, something extremely good arrives. And you think, that is so catchy, I am going to remember that, and I am so tired. And she said, gone. And then she said, don't listen to those voices saying you're tired. You need to record it right now. It does not matter if somebody thinks it's weird. Now, I am not writing songs. Nobody listening to this is going to be woken at 3 in the morning by a melody. That is not what I took from it. Here is what I took from it. I am 73 years old, and things arrive and go. Not tunes, things. A thing about my mother that I had not thought about in 40 years. The name of a woman who was kind to me in 1974. What Ed said in a car in 1979. They arrive, usually in the evening, usually when I am doing something with my hands. And I think, I must remember that. And they go. They go every single time. I bought a notebook on Wednesday. I want to report that plainly, and without making it into anything. I bought a notebook at a shop on Wednesday afternoon because a 36-year-old woman on a stage said you think you will remember it, and you will not. There are 11 things in it. I have had it for 2 days, and there are 11 things in it, and about 4 of them are things I had not thought about since the 1980s. 2 of them are about my mother. One of them is a thing Jason said in about 1994 that I laughed at for a week and had entirely lost. And one of them is where we had been in the photograph. I remembered on Thursday night at about 10 o'clock while I was doing something with my hands. I have had that photograph for 30 years, and I have looked at it about 1,000 times, and I could not have told you. We had been to a funeral. It was Ed's uncle. It was 1996, and it was in the afternoon, and it was about 90 minutes away, and both boys had to come because there was nobody to leave them with. And Travis was 7, and he had been extremely well behaved for about 4 hours in a room full of adults he did not know, and he got in the car and he was asleep before we got out of the car park. I wrote it in the notebook and then I went and told Ed and he said, that's right, that's where that is. And then he said, how did you get that? And I said, I don't know. It just came. They just come. And then they go. Write it down. Part 11. I asked her. I called her yesterday afternoon. I said, I've watched it 4 times. And Taylor Swift said, Donna, it's an hour long. And I said, I've watched it 4 times. She said, why? And I said, because I found 9 things. And she said, what 9 things? So I read them to her. It took about 6 minutes, and she did not interrupt once, which I noticed. And when I finished, she said, "You got the fearless one." And I said, "I sat down for the fearless one." And she said, "Nobody's mentioned it." I said, "Nobody?" And she said, "2 days." It's been up 2 days, and I've had about 400 messages about the washed up line, and not one about the mother song. I said, "Does that bother you?" And there was a pause. And she said, "No." Then she said, "Yes." Then she said, "It's the best thing I said all day." And I sat there and did it from memory, 18 years later, and everybody wanted the sad sentence about being 22. I said, "I noticed something else about it, and I want to ask you." And she said, "Go on." And I said, "You did it from memory." And Taylor Swift said, "Yes." And I said, "An entire verse, 18 years." And she said, "Donna, I know all of them." I said, "All of what?" And she said, "All of them. Every song I have ever written. I could do any of them right now." I said, "How many is that?" And she said, "I don't know. 300 and something." I said, "You know 300 songs from memory?" And my daughter-in-law said, "They're mine." She said it the way you would say something completely obvious. Not proudly, slightly impatiently, actually, as though I had asked her whether she knew her own telephone number. "They're mine." Part 12. What I asked her about the mother. And then I asked the thing I had called to ask. I said, "Who is it about?" And she said, "The song?" And I said, "Yes." And there was a pause that went on for long enough that I said her name. And she said, "I'm here." And then she said, "It's about my mother." I said, "I know it's about your mother, Taylor. I mean, who is the narrator?" And she said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "You wrote it at 18. You were not a small child running through a pumpkin patch at 18. You were remembering being one." I said, "So who is the narrator? Is it you at 8, or is it you at 18 remembering being 8? And there was a longer pause. And Taylor Swift said, "Nobody has ever asked me that." She said, "Give me a second." And she genuinely took one. I could hear her. And then she said, "It's me at 18 deciding what to keep." I did not say anything. And she said, "I was about to leave." She said, "I was 18 and I was about to go and do the thing I had been planning since I was 10, and I knew it was going to be enormous, and I did not know if I was going to be able to keep any of it." She said, "So, I wrote down the pumpkin patch." She said, "That's what that song is. It's an 18-year-old putting something in a box before she goes." I said, "Did your mother know?" And she said, "She knows now." And I said, "When did she find out?" And Taylor Swift said, "About 4 minutes after I played it to her, same as everybody." Part 12 and a half. I cannot hear my mother. I want to tell you what happened after I got off that telephone, because it is the reason I have been strange for 2 days, and it has nothing to do with anybody famous. She said, "They're mine." 300 songs. Every one of them. She could do any of them right now. And I put the phone down, and I stood in my kitchen, and I thought, I cannot hear my mother. She died in 1998. I had her for 45 years. I spoke to her, I would estimate, on approximately every day of my adult life until the spring of 1998, either in a room or on a telephone. That is thousands of hours, tens of thousands. And I cannot hear her. I want to be precise about what I mean, because it took me 2 days to be precise about it, and it is not what I thought it was at first. I have not forgotten her. I can see her. I can see her hands, and the way she stood at a sink, and a particular cardigan, and how she held a cup. I can tell you what she thought about a great many things, and what she would say about most situations, because I have been saying, my mother would have said, for 28 years. I know the words. I cannot hear the voice. I sat down at my own kitchen table on Thursday afternoon and I tried. I tried for about 20 minutes. I picked things she said constantly, things she said every week for 40 years, and I tried to hear them. And what I got was the shape of it, the rhythm, the fact that she went slightly up at the end of a question, which I know, because I do it, and both of my sons do it, and one of my granddaughters does it, and none of them have any idea where it came from. But the actual sound of it, the thing that would make me turn around in a shop if I heard it now, gone. I do not have a recording, not 1 second, not a message on a machine, not a video, not a tape. There was no reason to. Nobody recorded anybody in 1994. You would have had to have a reason, and there was no reason, because she was there. And I sat at that table and did the arithmetic, which is the part I would like the women listening to this to do with me. She died 28 years ago, and I have been losing the sound of her at some rate ever since, and I did not notice it happening, and at some point in the last decade the last of it went, and I could not tell you what year. I said something to Ed about it on Thursday evening. I said, "Can you hear your father?" And my husband said, "What?" And I said, "Your father's voice. Can you hear it?" And Ed Kelce stood in our kitchen and did a thing with his face and did not say anything for about 15 seconds. And then he said, "No." He said, "I can hear the whistle." I said, "What?" And he said, "He had a whistle." Coaching. I can hear the whistle exactly. He said, "I cannot hear him say anything." And then my husband, who has said perhaps 4 sentimental sentences per decade since 1953, said something I am going to put down exactly. He said, "I've got the whistle, and I have not got the man." Part 12 3/4. What I did on Friday. I did something yesterday, and I want to tell you about it because I would like somebody else to do it. I recorded myself. I want to be clear that I felt like an absolute fool. I am 73 years old, and I sat in my own kitchen with a telephone propped against a jar, and I pressed a button and talked, and it was one of the most uncomfortable things I have done this year. I did 4 minutes. I did not do anything clever. I did not give advice, and I did not tell anybody I loved them, because that is for a card. I described my mother's kitchen. That is all. 4 minutes about a kitchen in Ohio in about 1962, where the table was, what was on the windowsill, the specific noise the back door made, what she did on a Tuesday, what it smelled like in October. 4 minutes of a room that has not existed since 1979 and that nobody alive except me has ever stood in. And then I did a second one, and it is 31 seconds long, and it is the one that matters. I said the 4 things my mother said most. In her words. Her actual sentences, the ones she said every week for 40 years, and that I have said in her voice at family tables since 1998 without ever noticing I was doing it. I cannot do her voice. I want to be honest. I tried it once on the recording and stopped, because it was not right and it was worse than not doing it. But the words are there, and they are in mine now, and there is a file on a telephone, and my granddaughters are 6, 5, 4, and 1. Wyatt will be about 60 when I am the length of time away that my mother is now, and there will be 31 seconds. I sent it to Kylie. I did not tell her what it was. I sent a file and wrote, "Don't listen to this now, put it somewhere." And she wrote back about 4 minutes later and said, "Donna, what is it?" And I said, "It's for later." And Kylie Kelce wrote, "I've got you." 3 words and then nothing else, which is exactly the correct response and is why that woman has been the best thing to happen to this family since 2013. And then, about an hour later, she sent me something back. It is 11 seconds long. It is Finley, who is 17 months old, in a kitchen in Philadelphia, saying absolutely nothing of any kind, because she has no words yet, and laughing at something off camera. And Kylie wrote underneath it, So you've got hers, too. I have listened to 11 seconds of a baby laughing about 40 times since yesterday afternoon. She will be 54 in 50 years, and there will be 11 seconds of what she sounded like before she could say anything at all, and I will be a very long time gone, and somebody will have it. Part 13. What I Did Afterward. I got off the telephone, and I sat in my kitchen for a while. And then I did something. I went and found a photograph. It is from 1996, and it is in a drawer in this kitchen, and it has been in this house for 30 years. It is not a good photograph. It is slightly out of focus, and there is a thumb in the corner of it. It is Travis, asleep in the back of a car. I do not know where we had been. I have looked at it for 30 years, and I could not tell you where we had been. He is 7. He has got a coat on that was too big for him because it had been Jason's. His mouth is open. He is completely gone in the way that a 7-year-old is gone. I have had that photograph in a drawer for 30 years, and I have never once put it anywhere. I put it on the windowsill on Thursday. Ed came in and saw it, and did not say anything for about a minute. And then he said, "Where was that?" And I said, "I don't know." And he said, "Neither do I." And then my husband picked it up and looked at it for a while and put it back down and said, "He was asleep before we got out of the car park." And I said, "How do you remember that?" And Ed Kelce said, "He was always asleep before we got out of the car park." Part 14. For the people listening, 2 things and then I am finished. The first is about the demographic. There were men in a room in Nashville in about 2005 who had a piece of paper that said the customer is a 35-year-old woman, and they used it to tell a 16-year-old that her life was not relevant. You have been that piece of paper your whole adult life. You are a segment. You have been studied. There are people who know what you buy and when you buy it, and almost none of them have ever asked you a question. And a 16-year-old looked at that piece of paper and said no, and then sold an enormous number of records to the women on it. I do not have a lesson in that. I just wanted you to have it. The second is about the pumpkin patch. There is a song, written by an 18-year-old about her mother, in which the word mother does not appear. It is a child running through a pumpkin patch and hugging a pair of legs and falling asleep on the way home. And it is on an album from 2008, and almost nobody has ever noticed it, and my daughter-in-law recited it from memory, on a stage on Monday, and about 400 people wrote about a different sentence. Go and find your version. I mean this practically. Go and find the photograph in the drawer that you have never put anywhere, and put it somewhere. Not on a wall. Nobody needs to explain it to anybody. Put it on a windowsill where you make tea. Because I have had a photograph of a 7-year-old asleep in a car in a drawer since 1996, and it took a 36-year-old woman on a stage in Los Angeles to get it out. And it has been on my windowsill for 2 days, and I have looked at it about 40 times. And there is a third thing, and it is the one I actually want you to do. My daughter-in-law can recite 300 songs from memory, and she said, "They're mine," like I had asked her whether she knew her own telephone number. And I cannot hear my mother. 45 years of a woman I spoke to nearly every day of my adult life, and I have got the words, and I have not got the voice, and I did not notice it going. There is no recording. There was never a reason to make one. She was there. So, record yourself. Not a message, not advice. Nobody wants advice from a recording, and it will make you self-conscious, and you will not do it. Describe a room. Describe a room that no longer exists. Your mother's kitchen, the house you were in when you were 9, where the table was, and what was on the windowsill, and the noise the back door made. 4 minutes. Nobody has to hear it now. And then do a second one, 30 seconds, and say the 4 things your mother or your father said most, in their words. You will feel like a fool. I felt like an absolute fool, and I did it in my own kitchen with a telephone propped against a jar. Somebody in about 2075 is going to have 31 seconds of my voice saying 4 sentences my mother said in a kitchen in Ohio in 1962. That is more than I have got. That is considerably more than I have got. I'm Donna Kelce, Taylor Swift's mother-in-law. I sat down twice watching an hour of my daughter-in-law talking about songwriting. The first time was a sentence about remembering that told me something about my son that he has never said out loud and that I am not going to raise with him. The second time was a woman reciting a verse from memory about a child running through a pumpkin patch 18 years after she wrote it at 18 years old, deciding what to keep before she left. Both of mine did the legs. I had forgotten, and now I have not. There is a photograph of a 7-year-old asleep in the back of a car on my windowsill. It has been in a drawer since 1996, and I have looked at it perhaps 1,000 times, and I could not have told you where we had been. I remembered on Thursday night at 10 o'clock while I was doing something with my hands, because I had bought a notebook on Wednesday afternoon, because a 36-year-old woman said on a stage that you think you will remember and you will not. We had been to a funeral. He was 7, and he had been extremely good for 4 hours in a room full of adults he did not know, and he got in the car and he was gone before we left the car park. And there are 31 seconds on a telephone in Philadelphia of an old woman in Ohio saying 4 things her mother used to say because a 36-year-old told a room of songwriters that you think you will remember and you will not. And 11 seconds of a 17-month-old laughing at something off camera, sent back to me an hour later by her mother with 3 words underneath it. I cannot hear my mother. Somebody is going to be able to hear me. 17 days until Denver. Thank you for sitting with me today.